Welcome to the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowden, where we unpack the strategies and solutions that make localization fast, scalable, and efficient. I'm your host, Stefan Huyghe. Good morning here in Texas. Good afternoon in England. We're here with Edwin Trebels from the Philadelphia Church of God to talk about optimizing localization workflows and how we can get a faster time to market. Edwin, for the few people that don't know you around the localization spectrum, why don't we start with a quick introduction and tell people who you are?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. It's always good to talk to you. I'm Edwin, and I live in the UK, but I'm Dutch originally, so I wear a couple of hats. I'm the Director of LangOps at the Philadelphia Church of God, but then I'm also now helping with the LangOps Institute as the Director of Strategic Partnerships.
Awesome. We could actually be doing this in Dutch, right? Because we speak the same language. I'm from Belgium, you're from Holland. This is the first time I have somebody that speaks my native tongue on the podcast. Welcome. Let's dive right in. What are some of the key workflow steps that help you with automation? I have an initial question for you. What are the most time-consuming tasks for you in your localization workflow, and how are you aiming to automate them?
Well, a lot of the basic issues within localization, of course, revolve around translation work and editing work and finding the right folks to help with that. We are in a unique situation with the church in the sense that we mostly are empowered by volunteer translators and editors. So a lot of times we are simply restricted by who can help us and assist us. So we sometimes have issues with like certain bottlenecks so that we're trying to get around because we just don't have the volunteers in that area. And then basic things like communication, there's process management, and then of course the tech stack vendor management, trying to figure out what are the best tools out there, which ones fit in the best for our use case or use cases. And then, we use all kinds of various automation for that. We have translation management system, of course, a TMS, and we also have process management. We use Trello, and we have also, this year, we adopted Blackbird. So that's a no-code, low-code workflow automation tool that connects the various tools that we use. So that's really sped up a lot of our manual steps.
What are the most common pitfalls of over-automating your workflow, you think?
Right. That's a good question, because it is easy to say, okay, well, let's just automate everything or as much as we can. But when you do that, you can also get into some system fragility where you have issues, especially when you're dealing with various components that might be one might be updated, and all of a sudden the whole process breaks because of that. So you have to be careful. So in the first place, you have to first of all think, what should I automate and what should I not automate? Is it worth creating this automation, or will that cause more problems if it goes wrong? So you have to think about that. And then there's, of course, notifications that you can build in. We use Slack, for instance, where if something runs, then we get a notification. But if something goes wrong, then we can also start to decipher and analyze in those Slack messages that we're receiving on a different channel. Actually, it's a more advanced channel that only the solution architects have access to. They can then go in there and troubleshoot the issue in cooperation with whatever tool might be causing the issues. So I think about what to automate, what not to automate, and then notifications. So yeah, there's other automation issues like a lack of human intelligence, I would say, and insight. If you automate too much, then it's possible that you are automating things that should not be automated. Or perhaps you have to have really a human control step in place to make sure that that particular moment is classified correctly. Should it go into this workflow or the other workflow? Well, then maybe somebody needs to make that decision rather than automating that. I think that we are moving towards a world where more of that can be automated in the kind of like an agentic workflow, where there is more further classification that can be automated through intelligent use of AI. But I think a lot of care has to be taken before those kinds of things are implemented. But we're definitely moving in that direction rapidly, but we have to be careful at this point.
You mentioned Slack as a collaborative tool. That's an instant messaging tool between the people that are working on your team, I assume them. How do you use collaborative tools in other capacities to improve the speed or the execution of your translations?
Well, a TMS is a collaborative tool, so we use Crowd, like it allows us to collaborate with each other very well. One interesting thing about Crowd and one feature, what's interesting is the crowd part of Crowd, where you can actually have a translator do editing, and then that segment, once it's saved, it can actually already be filtered out by a proofreader for the next step. So it can actually be at a segment level rather than a whole document level. So in other words, a translator and a proofreader can work right behind each other. And then that actually can speed up a turnaround time quite a lot, actually, because normally you would have one person finish a document and then the next person finishes the document rather than almost at the same time. So in theory, that can almost half the turnaround time, which in practice it does that as well for the right kind of content. It does that.
So for all intents and purposes, you have people working on content at the same time as kind of what you're alluding to there. You don't have to step in and pass it off from the translator to the editor and from the editor to the proofer. You can just let them work in the content and take care of that particular step themselves, so to speak. What other features do you prioritize as a buyer for localization platforms? What are the most important things that make sense to you?
There's some basics, of course, for all vendor management where we're talking about, okay, well, what features have you got? I saw a funny meme the other day where you have this marketing part of a company and it's this beautifully, realistically drawn horse. And then you have the product side that is this like a stick figure of a horse. So unfortunately, sometimes you come across companies that are set up that way. The website is beautiful. The marketing is just right on the mark. And then the product is really quite undeveloped and it's lacking. And they're kind of wanting you to tell them what needs to be developed, and then they'll develop it maybe in collaboration with you, which to a certain extent that's fine. But when you're looking at an enterprise adoption of a technology, then that's a little scary if it's very new and it's really not tested by others very much and so on. So the robustness of the product is very important for that reason. Features are of course important, especially I think one of the basic ones is integrations and API access, and then specific parts of the API become very important when it comes to certain workflows.
What are the key integrations for you, if I may ask? Are they complex? Is that a feature that has given you trouble in the past? What needs to be absolutely connected and automated for you?
Right. So at the moment, usually when it comes to LLM or some of the other tech, so I'm asking for API access with system prompting, and then also like integration with TMS like Crowd and so on. So I often will ask providers like machine translation providers for those kinds of things right away because it's really powerful. We're building knowledge graphs right now, for instance, and that's really interesting, like and how that works. But you need to be able to set up this RAG pipeline to do that. So you kind of need some advanced access. Otherwise, it's not really a copy pasting situation anymore. Like if we want to integrate you into an advanced workflow, well, then you need to have that API access at a good price. Price has to be within reason for what it is.
For the listeners that are not familiar with knowledge graphs, can you maybe quickly explain that a little bit more? Because that's an interesting thing, and it's a term that comes up in the localization industry and in LangOps all the time. So I'd love to hear from you how that works in practice.
Knowledge graphs, I'm still learning a lot about that. Knowledge graphing uses semantic techniques in order to move unstructured knowledge to structured knowledge. So all of a sudden, instead of having all these documents and all sorts of content, you can create a structured knowledge graph of all of that, utilizing several semantic techniques, including an ontology. So an ontology is one concept is connected with this concept, and then the relationship is defined, and then you build it out from there. A simple example would be a father is connected to a son, and then also a daughter, and so on. So you have these connections, but of course, with knowledge graphing, then you can utilize that in combination with large language models in order to provide more high quality output within your knowledge graph knowledge. So within your domain or your niche, and that way you are significantly reducing your hallucinations, as they call it, which is actually a feature of LLM, but it reduces that and it increases the quality of the output.
If I understand correctly, it allows you to use unstructured data in a much more creative way, and the output that you're getting is depending on the context of the text in which it appears. And thus, this is kind of like a futuristic way of using an unstructured translation memory, right? It's different solutions for different contexts. And since we're now using AI, it can come up with the right solution for a specific case scenario without you having to hard code it in.
Exactly. So you can use it for machine translation improvement. You can use it for automatic post editing with an agentic workflow, which Crowd enables that with an AI proofreader that they have, which is powered by LLM, but then in theory it could also be in combination with the knowledge graph. And then you also have other use cases, which I'm working on for other departments outside of the localization industry, which then all of a sudden starts getting into a more of a LangOps approach, like the language operations, not just within the world of translations and interpretations, but it goes beyond that, where language, including the source language, becomes operationalized and becomes a strategic asset across various departments, from content creation, whether that's text or imagery or video or audio, all the way to front end support, those who answer phone calls, emails, and so on, and letters. It's all those people that can be supported with this structured knowledge.
Very, very interesting. So now we've talked a little bit about automating things, and I can imagine it's wonderful for you to speed up the workflow, but at some point you're responsible for the output as well. How do you maintain transparency and accountability in such a collaborative workflow? Because while you're automating, it would seem to me you're also obfuscating some of your overview of what's going on. How to keep track of things?
Yes, that's a very good point. I'm a very big fan of visualization for that reason, making sure that the various steps in the process are visualized in proper process management. So we use Kanban style organization on Trello, where we have each step is a list, and then we have templating, and the template can be taken up once a product is classified. Let's say a blog post, it's initiated for translation, and then the template is taken automatically, copied, and then it starts the process, and that card will move semi-automatically across the process. So it's all very visual, and you can see it, and you can also analyze it. So because of the visualization, you can see where the inefficiencies are. For instance, maybe one step is very fast and another step is very slow, and then you have a visual. You can see the bottleneck right in front of you, and then you can see what maybe needs to be done in order to remedy that. So there's really just this one-piece flow across the board, so that the capacity is utilized to the max, but also not underutilized, if that makes sense.
And what happens when you have a bottleneck localization-wise? Sometimes things get stuck in the approval stages. Is your customer involved? Obviously, you're the customer, but do you have to have internal people approve certain things, and how does that kind of fit together in your process?
I think that there's different solutions to different types of bottlenecks. It depends what the bottleneck is, but usually you either need more resources within that, like it's either human resources or technological resources within that spot. So you can find different solutions for that. Sometimes you have to reconsider if that step is even necessary. Is it still necessary to have this step? It's always good to question that, rather than just assume the status quo. Is it necessary? Or can we train more people to fulfill that step? So if an approval step is really a bottleneck, are there more people that we can train in order to widen that capacity so that that bottleneck isn't the bottleneck anymore? It actually just flows at exactly the same speed as other things. And other times you're just taking on too much work. That's also possible. You're just taking on too much work and you actually don't have the capacity for that. So that becomes a bigger question, like a strategic question, like do we have enough of the resources in general, or what are we trying to accomplish, and are all of those products or things actually contributing to the overall objective of the company or the enterprise or the nonprofit?
We've talked a little bit about how you are using technology in a cutting edge way, knowledge graphs in particular. I'm just wondering, how does that work with the feedback loops compared to a traditional localization workflow where the end result is maybe translation memory that gets updated? Is there a way that you make sure that things get integrated properly in your continuous workflow? How is that different from the traditional workflow is probably the better question.
Right. So that's a very interesting question. It's knowledge management so that you get into at that point. So you find out an issue downstream, and then you do have to have a process in place, of course, where that issue is reported and then incorporated. In the case of knowledge graphs, they can be updated. So they can simply, let's say, okay, like conceptually, this was really wrong. This is not what we were looking for. Well, then let's go back into the knowledge graph and edit it. Because really a knowledge graph creation is semi-automatic. It's not automatic, it's semi-automatic. So there's a certain automation that can be applied to knowledge and then works pretty well, but it still needs to be updated. And then you need to go in there personally and actually change it up.
And who does the updating then? Do you do the updating? Or does the linguist do the updating? Is it the same update across all languages? I'm just trying to wrap my head around how the workflow is fundamentally different from a traditional workflow.
Well, that's right. So yeah, I do that at the moment, but that's because we are kind of at the beginning stages of this technology. Eventually you would build that out. So there's more and more people that would get access to something like this. And which of course, you have to be careful, of course, like who do you give access to? Are they fully trained? Do they understand how it works and so on? So there are training programs that we would have in place once you start scaling up this process. But yeah, essentially, they can just go in there, and it's multilingual. So an ontology is multilingual. You can connect multiple languages to this knowledge graph.
How many languages are you translating into?
Well, at the minute, we're basically using 10 languages. So we go very broad and deep with it. So we have a vast array of products within each language.
How do you align expectations across a diverse team like that of 10 different languages, a bunch of linguists that work together collaboratively, and then you overseeing it?
Yeah, we have specific managers for different roles. I'm the director over those managers, and the managers, they are in charge over languages, and they have local knowledge as well. So they know, they're typically native speakers of that language. So of course, they're not just project managers. They have a lot of deep understanding themselves. Oftentimes, in our case, they are final editors or they're the head editor of that language as well. And then we just have various roles in place, linguistic roles, to ensure the quality. And a lot of training goes into that. And regular meetings and discussions and style guides, of course, which is also an interesting thing. We are incorporating more and more style guide points into prompting so that there's some automatic post-editing being done so that, we don't have to worry about those things, so that our human beings can focus on what's really the most important things to focus on, which is, for the most part, not as much fluency anymore due to the high quality of fluency of machine translation, but it's also, for the most part, factual accuracy and reasoning.
And the linguists that are involved in your projects, they're by and large volunteers, you said. and they're doing post editing then, if I understand it correctly, of content. Do you have a system of automated QA where issues get flagged and that's what your linguists are reviewing, or how does that work? How do you balance the speed and the quality of things?
Not all our content is MTPE, but a lot of it is at this point in time. We have a variety of quality checks, automated ones, and a very thorough review process, just due to the importance that we place on our particular kind of content. So we pretty much always have at least two people looking at content before it's published, if not more in some cases, even though it's machine translation. We call them drafts.
And then the linguists that are working on this, since they're volunteers, how do you organize their deadlines and how do you make sure that they deliver on time and that things are not getting held up along the way?
Well, in the first place, we know them really well. Like community members, of friends, they come over for dinner. We know them really well. And we know their situation, and we know they're very honest about what they can do and cannot do. And we periodically ask them, like, just let us know how things are going, and don't feel bad if you can't do something, because it's very mission driven. They're volunteering because they want to support our efforts. If anything, they want to do more than maybe they should sometimes, in the sense that they are really working very hard. So as far as deadlines go, we hit them very easily. Typically, it's very easy. But we also are very conscious of what our actual capacity is. We don't overburden the system, if that makes sense, and we don't overburden people if we can possibly prevent that from happening. So we're very careful about that, just making sure that we don't create more products if we really can't keep up with that, because that would just create a very stressful situation for everyone. And it's just kind of frustrating, of course, even for the audience, because we have an internal audience and an external audience, and we don't want to frustrate either of them, of course. So we are very careful to understand what our actual capacity is, and then that's what we just keep following that. So actually, a lot of times deadlines aren't even necessary. We do have deadlines for certain products because we just have to go to print or something like that with certain magazines. But it's a very deep understanding of the process that allows us to flow really nicely without undue stress on anyone.
One of the reasons I really was interested in interviewing you is because you seem to be farther ahead than a lot of the people that I meet on the buyer side in localization. So since you're farther ahead in the automation process, maybe a good question to part on is this: if somebody was at the very beginning of this process and had a very traditional localization workflow, what would be your recommendation to improve their efficiency without overwhelming their localization team from the get-go?
That is a question that relates to bringing a company or a group of people from one maturity level to a next, and then to the next, and then the next, and the next. I would always make sure that you look at your objective, first of all. What are you trying to accomplish? And then start breaking that down in various steps. So once you start understanding the process, then you can start to implement questions, first of all, to see, okay, should we have this step? Should we have this step? And so on and so on. What can we manage? And then more towards the end of that thinking process, you start to think of solutions, and then you introduce them incrementally. So as small steps. But typically, if you do continuous improvement, you get to the bigger step, which might take a little bit more planning, but it's good to put in that effort, to put in the planning and make sure that the adoption is understood by everyone. Why are we doing it? And how do we do it? How do we actually use this new tool? And then you move forward, and then you make more changes. It's just incrementally. So I would just start very small. I think we tend to just change too much. I am very guilty of that too, where I want to change the whole universe all in one day, but that doesn't work. You always have to have a certain humility, actually, to understand what is it that I can actually reasonably accomplish in this amount of time, and what is really the first step, rather than jumping to the first 10 steps. So let's just focus on the first step, move along very carefully.
You have to pace yourself. I've enjoyed geeking out with you so much today. We'll have to do it again soon and maybe do a second volume of this. I have lots of questions remaining. Thank you so very much, Edwin, for joining us on the Agile Localization Podcast, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Stefan.
Well, folks, that's a wrap on today's episode of the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowden. We hope you found it as insightful as we did. If you enjoyed today's conversation and want to learn more about how leading companies are managing their multilingual content efficiently, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Thank you for tuning in. For more resources on how to streamline your localization process, visit crowden.com. See you next time.